Hey everyone, and welcome to RPG Horror Stories with DnD Doge. In today's video, we have a story about a player substituting for a Dungeons & Dragons group's normal dungeon master, and uses it for personal gain. A story about a player trying to give another player's character some milk in a disgusting way, and much more. But before we get into those, here are some wise words from Ziggy the Wise.
Remember to like the video and subscribe. I really like this toy.
Thank you for that, Ziggy. I hope they do those things too. But with that said, let's get into today's D&D horror stories. Railroad DMPC Shopping Trip by Reddit user Spooky Minimalist. Hi all, this is a story from my university days. It all started when our main dungeon master had to take a break because of final exams. One of the other players enthusiastically declared that he would like to try his hand at DMing and step in for a few sessions. Now, this particular player was a bit of a power gamer and a rules lawyer, so we were a bit weary, but gave it a shot anyway. Boy, were we in for something. By the way, I am not naming any non-generic classes because A, this happened in 2004 or 2005, so details are hazy, and B, we were using a heavily homebrewed version of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, and we had all the source books, and then some. So the adventure starts, and we all wake up at a beach after a storm. No equipment, no spellbooks, and no memories out to how we got there. Okay, odd, but what the heck. We start exploring and find a shipwreck which has been picked clean. There was nothing we could use or that could help us, and the dungeon master pointed this out repeatedly each time with a smug grin. Then each of us noticed that we all had a really sore feeling in one of our toes. After a quick check, we all noticed that everyone had one toenail completely removed. Weirdly specific and rather odd. At that point, the railroad began. We all felt compelled to walk up the beach and follow a trail which led us to a mansion. Inside the mansion, we were greeted by a shaman and a warrior, who were really smug. The warrior declared that we had been chosen to fight in the nearby dungeon, and if we succeeded, we could keep all of the treasure we found. We would also get our equipment back once we returned. When asked what would happen if we did not want to participate, the shaman smugly presented us with voodoo dolls of ourselves, with the toenails as breast ornaments, and then proceeded to make all of us hop around to the dungeon master's amusement. We all then complained as players to the dungeon master that this was an awful way to start an adventure, but the dungeon master simply said that it was his first attempt, and we should cut him some slack. So we did, but it was not a good idea. We got some very basic equipment, and were told to find everything else in the dungeon, which we proceeded to clear out. At least, we tried to. The dungeon master used the voodoo dolls to remote control our characters whenever he thought that we were not moving quick enough, or wanted to go left when he wanted us to go right. It left us frustrated, and also under the impression that this was an unfinished dungeon, and of course, it was a massive drain on the fun. Our loot was also meager. Some melee weapons with a +1 or a +2, a few spell scrolls and potions, but nothing fancy for our group, as we were all around level 15. Especially our two spellcasters were at a serious disadvantage. If it had not been for our cleric, who could pray for spells 4 times a day, they surely would have died. The more we struggled, the more amused the dungeon master got. Then, finally, we get to the final room, which was guarded by some fiend. I want to say it was a Yugolov, but I'm not sure. And it was sitting on a massive hoard of treasure. The dungeon master went to great length describing the treasure, specifically pointing out 3 magical items that were of particular use to his player character, which of course he was not playing at the time. We assumed that this was a hint that we should pick those up for him once the demon was defeated, But we were wrong. Before combat started, another player pointed out that this fiend could not be harmed by any weapon that we got, and the 2 fireballs our wizard could still cast would not do either. Dungeon Master, again very smugly, declared that we got here before we cleared the whole dungeon, so it was our fault that we did not have better equipment. We in turn pointed out that his remote controlling our characters prevented us from exploring certain parts of the dungeon, to which the Dungeon Master replied that he did not prevent us from going back and trying again. This went back and forth for a while, with us getting more and more frustrated, and the Dungeon Master getting more and more amused, until eventually, the Dungeon Master declares that the fiend was attacking us now. As expected, we all nearly die, until Shaman and Warrior from the beginning burst in and one-shot the fiend. Then they declare that we had failed miserably, and therefore all the loot would go to Warrior's cousin, who was, drumroll, Dungeon Master's regular player character. So this whole adventure was just a setup so that the Dungeon Master could get all the artifacts he wanted, and then some. He even declared, "There is no rule against doing that." We banned the Dungeon Master from the group after that, and when he apologized a few weeks after, he had to create a new character. So, as I understand it, when the normal Dungeon Master had to take a break, this player took over, and instead of running some one-shots or something, just continued on with the characters from their main campaign. What this Dungeon Master did, with the whole thing about the characters being controlled by voodoo dolls, was already pretty egregious. But to then take all of the characters' items and weapons away, have them go to a dungeon where they had no agency as to where they'd like to explore, and then blame them when they failed the fight with the fiend, all to presumably give his character super special items when the normal Dungeon Master returned, is downright stupid. I wonder if he really thought that the normal Dungeon Master would be okay with this. But as he found out, he wasn't, and was forced to make a new character. But hey, at least the substitute Dungeon Master apologized, and presumably learned a lesson here. Or one would hope. Let's move on. No, I Don't Like Milk, by Reddit user Baltheron. Content warning for SA against fictional characters, as well as inappropriate conversations with minors. Hi there, long-time lurker, first-time poster. This is a story from a few years back, in my mid-teenage years, a 15-year-old male at the time, which is relevant to the story. A lot of things happened with this particular group that was awful, but for the purpose of word count, we'll be focusing on the main antagonist and her blights against me. I had been invited to an online campaign by a longtime friend who was eager to play with me, and given this was my first full introduction to Dungeons & Dragons, I was delighted to join. Playing an ex-aerial dancer and grave domain cleric, I thought on first impressions that the party was well-rounded. We had 7 players in total of all different ages and backgrounds, both in-game and in real life. The campaign had already been going for a few sessions when I had joined, but the first session I joined, we had been laughing and joking and just having a great time, even with the villain of my story. I didn't see anything wrong, at first. I should have been more curious when my friend left. 3 sessions in, my character and me get to learn that the villain's end goal was to completely destroy the universe, following the goals of the god that she worshipped, and everyone else in the party is entirely cool with it. Not once previously had this been mentioned to me before joining, so I did as I thought my character would and argued back, asking why and if this was really necessary. Her response was, "Oh, well, I wouldn't destroy you guys, obviously. We can remake the universe with new people, and we can be gods." Since everyone else seemed fine with it, I didn't argue much at the time, though my character had a good few monologues about why it seemed morally wrong, and debating attempting to end the villain's life during a long rest. Not acted upon, but definitely had some good roleplay moments in there. During one of these long rests, where my character was being relatively quiet but otherwise standoffish with the villain, she asks the DM to perform this glorious action. I'd like to grab my character and have him drink from my breast to make him feel better. Huh? The DM says, roll a strength check. Y'all, when I say I heard the record scratch in my head, I swear I thought I had misheard her. But nope. Apparently, one of the gifts she had gotten for doing her god's bidding was physical form enhancements, including the ability to produce chocolate milk from her. You get the idea. I immediately dropped character and stated firmly that I was not comfortable with that, to which she tried to insist that I could roll against her, but it wasn't against the rules or anything. I let them know that I refused to continue if they were going to make me do that, and luckily, the Game Master, upon hearing that, told her to cut it out. She complained and made snide remarks about it later on, but otherwise, we moved on. Or tried to. For a bit of context, with this next part, I'm going to give you all the basic rundown of what, quote, kinning is, regarding late 2010s Tumblr lingo. Essentially, the belief that in an alternate universe, you were a different person, usually a character. She had kinned her character, the villain. Of course she did. This alone wasn't a problem, had we not been in my second to last session with this group. We were making small talk before the session, when I and the rest of the party got hit with this absolute banger. Yeah, I had a dream last night that the villain held down my character and raped him while he drank my chocolate milk. I think it was a kin memory. I wish I was making this up. At the time, I laughed it off, wildly uncomfortable that this grown woman was having fantasies of her assaulting my character, especially considering I was a minor, and we had someone even younger than me as part of the party. By this point, I reached out and told my friend, who in turn did the responsible thing as the person who brought me into the group, and reported her to the forum that our group had manifested from. As far as I'm aware, to this day, she's blacklisted from several different larger Dungeons & Dragons group finding spaces. I wish I could say that the last session was eventful, but it wasn't. I just decided that I wasn't having fun and left the group. It ended up turning me off from the game as a whole up until college, and now I'm happy to report being in a lovely group where people actually listen to boundaries. Lesson learned? Stand up for myself at the first problem. TLDR. Problem player, amongst other things, tried to force my character to suck milk from her boob, had dreams about raping my character, and proceeded to get blacklisted from the game search forum we were a part of. Man, that story was just... what? It's one thing to try to force what the player was attempting to do to OP's character, which, what kind of dungeon master gives that ability to someone anyways? Though, at least the DM put a stop to it after seeing that OP would leave if it continued. But the whole kinship thing, and that player saying that she had a dream that OP drank her chocolate breast milk, and thought it was a memory of another life or something. It's no wonder that OP just noped the heck out of there. No D&D is better than forced chocolate milk D&D. This is definitely one of the strangest stories I've read to date. Let's move on. New player. Dungeon Master only cares about him having fun. By Reddit user IcyConstant9590. Let me preface this by saying that I'm a new Dungeons & Dragons player. I have never played before, except for Baldur's Gate 3, if you count that as D&D. I got invited by a friend to join his Dungeons & Dragons table. It was a group of 7, where half of them played before, and the other half didn't. The Dungeon Master, who's the friend, had some experience with one-shots. I didn't know what to expect, but what was sold was a beginner-friendly campaign, using a pre-made campaign. The first few sessions were okay. We were going through combats relatively easy. My character was getting stronger, and I was mostly okay with it. except for one thing: player agency. I didn't feel like I had any choice in anything, as most of the time I was never offered to roll on things, and whenever I spoke, I felt like my actions or words had zero impact on things. But it was the first few sessions, so I didn't really care that much. Later on though, I noticed he started to make combat harder and harder, and would get angry whenever he didn't get good rolls. To make things worse, at one point, he got angry with me because I corrected him with the use of one skill. Yes, I searched the skill on Google. And that he purposely changed it to try to kill me, and told me so, although he couldn't finish the deed. At that point, I got really angry with the situation and wanted to quit the group, but was persuaded by my girlfriend to stay because they're my friends. So I didn't quit. I decided to voice my concerns a week before the last session, discussing the limited agency, challenging combats, and what felt like intentional sabotage. Surprisingly, the Dungeon Master acknowledged these issues, expressing a desire for more role-playing and suggesting that players initiate roles. Despite this, during the last session, I found myself facing impossible tasks, and a forced conflict that led to a player character's death, and just general chaos. We short-rested in a dungeon after 2 combat encounters, and were cursed and forced to kill each other. When I asked the Dungeon Master privately about these decisions, the response was, "Have you not realized that I can do whatever the F I want?" This was the breaking point, and I made the decision to quit the group. Maybe that's normal, but I'm here to have fun, and I was clearly not having fun. Yeah, it definitely sounds like this Dungeon Master had a DM versus player mentality, with the way he would get angry when he would roll low during battles. That may be why he ramped up the difficulty, and even purposefully changed the way a skill worked in order to try to kill OP's character. Then to have them be cursed during a rest in a dungeon to kill each other is just outlandish. This is basically confirmed when the Dungeon Master told OP that he can do anything he wants, so I would say it was good for OP to leave this group. It's just a shame that their first Dungeons & Dragons experience resulted in him learning that no D&D is better than bad D&D. On to the next one. The Dungeon Master Wanted Murder Hobos by Reddit user 3-Toed Goblin. So this happened a couple of years ago. I wanted to join a campaign, and a friend invited me to his group. We played the first session online. I spoke to the DM beforehand, and he was very friendly and indulged our backstories, so I was positive going into the game. We started playing, and the first thing that I noticed was just how big the group was. The Dungeon Master had 10 players on his hands. Now, I generally prefer a group of 4 to 5, so that everyone can have an input, and combat does not take too long, but I thought I'd stick it out and see how he manages it. We started well enough, and the roleplay was fun, but with 10 players vying for the spotlight, I found myself on mute most of the time. After introducing our characters and cramming into a tavern, I found myself unable to do much else than sit and listen. 2 players went off on their own to the basement, as they had spoken to an NPC who told them to kill some rats down there. Original, I know. And without informing the party, they set off to do it themselves. I'm not one for metagaming, so my character remained seated at the tavern having a drink. The 2 players proceeded to nearly die against the rats, killing a couple in the process. Each combat round, we reminded them that we did not know that they were fighting, so the Dungeon Master had us roll perception in the noisy tavern, with disadvantage, and we kept failing the check. Eventually, another player metagamed to run into the fight, and was kind enough to call out to the rest of us so we could hear it. At this point, my character got up and started sprinting towards the fight. Some of the other players chose to remain in the tavern, as I think they had lost interest by this point. The 3 who were there managed to kill off all the rats before my character had made it to the fight, because I was in initiative from when I heard the call, and could only move my speed to get there. After the fight, the Dungeon Master said that the only people who had actually fought the rats were getting experience for the fight, because everyone else chose not to get involved, and that if we did not start joining into the fights, we would fall behind in levels. I need to point out, 1. We did not know there was a fight. 2. The Dungeon Master made us roll to hear the fighting, and was aware that we had failed the rolls. And 3. The moment I did find out there was a fight, I was running to go help. It felt ridiculous to me that I had played true to what my character knew, and was somehow punished for it. Even worse, it spawned a competitive type of gameplay, where the characters did not tell each other of quests, so that they could get more experience. On top of that, they got experience for killing, which made a couple of players go, well, then we could just kill everything, right? Because roleplay was not rewarded in any way. It felt like the Dungeon Master was trying to encourage murder-hobo behavior, and punish any other way of playing. I left the group not long after that, and haven't joined a new one since. The friend who had dragged me into the group has barely spoken to me since then, because I made him look bad in front of his friends. It sounds to me like OP simply didn't jive with the way that this group liked to play Dungeons & Dragons. The way the Dungeon Masters seemed to run things with XP, and the way that the players would kind of compete with each other to get said XP could lead to some murder-hobo behavior with the players. But by the sounds of it, they didn't mind it. OP did do the right thing to just leave the group, as he didn't much like how the game was going. That, and the game having 10 players, could just get downright hectic, and wouldn't give much time for some players to roleplay over the more boisterous players. But for OP's friend to not talk to OP after leaving the game is kind of childish and messed up. Hopefully, that can be rectified. But if he keeps not talking to OP just for leaving a Dungeons & Dragons game, then I would say that they weren't that great of a friend to begin with. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you. I hope you remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.